have old stories that sometimes it's like they're scar tissue, that they don't bother you most of the time, but then sometimes when they get triggered, they resurface. And it's like an old wound that gets re injured. And I want to share a story about what you can do to really start to move through that so it doesn't take you down, doesn't make you want to crawl into a ball and feel over anxious and want to attack or feel like you have to defend yourself, but instead to honor the old story and allow it to be released so you can start to step into a new story. So for me, where my story starts is when I was 7 years old, my mother, my grandmother, my sister, and I, we were moving from Ohio to Colorado. And my mom and dad had been divorced since before I was even born. And we would see my dad on the weekends. And, while it was difficult to have this kind of two household, when I was with my dad, he was pretty attentive. And I don't remember ever really having a conversation about us leaving. And I don't ever even remember saying goodbye to him. It was like he didn't factor into the story at all. And of course, at the time, I didn't really have the emotional capacity to understand, nor did I have parents who could talk me through this and help me through this. So it planted this little seed of the story of abandonment, right? That somehow he had abandoned me, even though we were the ones leaving. And of course, then it made me put on this defense mechanism of thinking I had to protect myself and be super self-sufficient, super self-reliant, thinking I didn't need anyone, which of course doesn't do well in this world, especially when you're designed for relationships. So for me, learning and through my story of, continuing on this path of, healing and forgiveness, one of the things that happens in any sort of trauma is that you form bonds, right? So my sister and I formed this bond of, we were these two kids whose, of course, most families are dysfunctional, coming from this dysfunctional family, and grew really close together to the point where, even though she lived in Ohio and I lived in Colorado, as we got older, I would cry every time I left, every time I'd go visit. And it was just this really strong emotional bond, of course, because we didn't have much emotional support as children. So when she moved to Colorado in 2008, I had this fear of like, oh gosh, she's going to move back to Ohio. And for some reason, it just was this like almost felt like an attack on me. Like I wasn't good enough for her to stay here, which of course is not true. But as the old story for me as a child being abandoned, thinking I was being abandoned, was still there. And so over the years, that was always kind of like in the background, right? She might move back. Well, life happens and our paths ended up diverging and our relationship kind of went on different paths and we hadn't been in touch in a long time. And I called her today for her birthday and found out she is moving to Ohio. And it was so interesting because when I heard the news, even though we haven't been in touch and I've done a lot of healing and forgiveness work, I could still feel that old trigger that, why? She's leaving me. And instead of in the past where I would, maybe get super emotional and kind of feel like I had to defend and prove and be anxious, this time I was able to notice and I was able to think, wow, how interesting. There's those old feelings. There's that old story. How interesting. And then to come back to, the adult mind, the rational mind to say like, hey, y'all haven't even, been in touch for a long time. What's the difference if she lives in the same city, if you're never really, don't really have a relationship versus if she lives in a different city in a different state? And through that, I've been able to honor what I was feeling and not let it own me, and also know where it came from and just thinking, wow, it must have been really hard as a 7-year-old girl moving all the way across the country away from her childhood, which my childhood had been, my grandparents lived there, my uncle and cousins lived there. Of course, I had friends. My dad was close by. You'd see him on the weekends, leaving what was familiar and had become safe for me to a whole new different place. And of course, that's going to be scary. And not having, a supportive family that could talk me through that. Of course, there's a little story got created about I need to make sure I take care of myself because no one else is. And just realizing and being able to be compassionate with that girl, like, wow, how hard that must have been. And wow, how creative and resilient of you to create the survival kit of self-protection. And of course, you don't need that survival kit anymore. And you didn't need that ever, really. But as a kid, you didn't know, right? And what helps you as if this happens to you, you get triggered by some old event, something gets, and it's the thing that is lovely about being triggered is that it's showing you what still needs to be healed, or in this case, how much you have already been healed and how much it's like an old injury, how you can bounce back much more quickly the second time because you have done so much healing and so much, physical therapy if it was a physical injury, right? So you're much stronger now than you were before. And of course, with emotional, it's the same. You've done so much emotional support and much more healing so that you're able to handle those triggers much more easily. And to come back to the truth, this is what heals everything, is to come back to the truth. To look at that old story, of course, with compassion and kindness for what it must have been like as a child to go through that. And then to be able to say, hey, it's actually not true. You aren't abandoned. You aren't alone. You are supported, because the truth is God has always been with you, and God will never abandon you, and he'll never turn his back on you. And he was with you then, and he's with you now, and he'll be with you forever. So it's not even true. And that's the funny thing about those little seeds of doubt, those little lies that get planted in us, is that once you believe them, then they become more powerful. And that's when you begin to act in ways to protect yourself, because you think you're doing what is necessary, but you're actually living out of a lie, basically. And so when you can connect to the truth, then that old story doesn't have any power over you anymore, because you know, I am supported. I am loved. And of course, God is with me. Of course, God has always been with me. Of course, God will always be with me. And he will always love me no matter what I do, no matter where I go, no matter what happens. And he's with me in those moments of going through those trials. And as soon as I can connect back to that truth, then those trials become much more easy to handle, much easier to handle. So then you're able to look at your situation like I was today and just be so happy for my sister and be able to, bless her journey and to bless my journey and see how far we both have come emotionally, and to really honor that she gets to go do this. She gets to go to Ohio, and it's not about me. It was never about me. But that's the little seed of the victim, right? Of like, it's all about you. And why aren't you good enough for them to not do what they did to you and to stick around, right? And that's the kid. Like, why am I not good enough that my dad didn't stick around? But it was never about me in the first place, right? And so when you can come back to the truth that it's not about you, for one, you're not a victim, for two, and for three, that you're not alone, you are supported, and you are so very loved, that God will never abandon you ever. And his love for you is eternal and everlasting, no matter what you do, no matter where you go. So then you're able to really just be in a place of poise and peace, no matter what triggers come, because then you can see how far you've grown and you can let them go. And as you step into that new story that you're already in, that's evolving and you're continuing to create, that you are becoming, for me, you're becoming the woman that God created you to be. And that's a woman with a bold heart, a woman who can love even when it's difficult, a woman who can tell the truth even when it's scary, and a woman who can be the light for others instead of having to attack or defend or get defensive or roll up into a ball and get super anxious. being able to be present with what is and be love in what is. So I would love to hear your stories of, what are those old stories that sometimes get triggered? And what are you doing when that happens? What are your tools to help you navigate that? And if you're in a place where you are really ready to get out of that old story and want to create and live into a new story where you are thriving in your career and thriving in your relationship and really rediscovering your true identity in God, I encourage you to reach out to me, and we can explore working together my 4-month BoldHearted relationship evolution mentorship, where you will become the bold-hearted woman you are designed to be. So I invite you to message me and we can explore what that looks like over chat. And if you have questions, please leave them. And if you have insights, I would love to hear. All right. Thanks for being here. Bye.